You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 9th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio.
How can protesters avoid helping the governments they're protesting against? Are reporters entitled to express opinions which may not be shared by their employers? And can we name 3 more atrocious wastes of everybody's time than sitting through an AI-generated musical? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Terry Stiastny and Yossi Meckelberg will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the Times Berlin correspondent Oliver Moody about his new book, Considering the Countries Which Share a Baltic Sea Shoreline. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller. I'm joined today by the political journalist and author of Believable Lies, which exists, is a thing and does hit shelves on June 12th, Terry Stiastny, and by Yossi Meckelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Terry, you've been alluding to it, talking about it, superstitiously declining questions about it for years, as regular listeners will know, and it exists. Congratulations. Do plug it absolutely mercilessly.
Thank you. It has been seen actually in a shop now, even though it's not officially out until Thursday. So I believe there are some in Daunt Books in Marylebone and all other good bookshops, hopefully. It's a story about wartime propaganda and fake news, particularly fake news which was broadcast via radio into occupied Europe and all the sort of mad cast of characters who produced that.
And that title again?
Believable Lies.
Yes, excellent advance Christmas present. I mean, it's never too early.
Father's Day. Good one for Father's Day.
It sounds very... When is Father's Day? Is that
this Sunday?
Okay. Well, will it be available in stores in time?
It will be. It'll be there on Thursday. You can.
That is a
now.
Scorching hot Father's Day tip. Yossi, have you got anything you want to sell while you're here, or not so much?
No, first to congratulate Terry on her book.
You have, however, been travelling.
I've been travelling. I was in The Hague, and I know
I'm rising above the how did you please.
I know. I went there without an arrest warrant, just in case you worried about that. No, I actually was invited, and since they put it on social media, I'm allowed to say that by the Dutch Foreign Ministry, which is probably one of the most active foreign ministries. The civil servants themselves, they actually demonstrate against their own government in front of their own building, against the role of the Dutch government in the war in Gaza, or they become, as they said, complicit by their support of Israel, or providing, for instance, certain F-15 that were then banned by the court. So the idea is, so I wrote an article when I saw that 800 civil servants across the Atlantic signed a letter about the role of civil servants, warning their governments against being complicit in violation of human rights or violating international treaties and conventions they are signed, and they picked it up and start a conversation with them. So they invited me to talk not only about this specific issue, but what's the role of civil servants in their relations with politicians. How far can they go? For instance, should they go and talk in public about what they warn politicians? Where is the loyalty, which obviously they're also citizens, and the loyalty is to the Constitution. So it created a series of meetings which were very interesting.
Well, there's a couple of themes there to which we will be returning, because we will commence with a sort of planet-wide survey of protest, tumult and general brouhaha. In Los Angeles, the disturbances that US President Donald Trump could scarcely have done more to provoke are ongoing. In recent developments, California Governor Gavin Newsom has confirmed that he plans to sue the Trump administration for calling out the California National Guard without consulting him. In Spain, Spain, huge demonstrations have been held demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, whose attempts to extricate himself from assorted corruption scandals have gone about as well as thrashing in quicksand usually does. And off the coast of the Gaza Strip, a yacht carrying a small amount of aid and a contingent of activists has been intercepted by Israeli forces. Its crew will be deported forthwith. Terry, first of all, the big question before we get into some smaller ones. These various kinds of direct action and others that we witness fairly frequently, do we think they rarely or ever make any actual difference to anything?
I think sometimes they do. I think, these are very different types of protests, obviously, in very different types of places. So it's interesting to try and think what the common thread is. And I suppose the thing that links them, thinking about them, is a sense that democratic processes aren't working properly. People are either seeing in the States, perceiving people sort of going beyond the law and violating the law. In Israel, likewise. In Spain, there's a worry about corruption and, the party politicians doing things. I mean, I think protests can be effective. I think sometimes, though, it does give the government that is being protested against an excuse to try and crack down even further. I mean, we've seen Donald Trump calling the protests in LA insurrectionist. He might threaten to try and, use the Insurrection Act against that. And if you think back to big historical protests like in 1968, for instance, in France or in the United States, that ended up having the political effect of bringing in kind of ultimately more conservative governments than the ones people were protesting against.
Well, indeed. So, Yossi, is there anything to the argument which some people are trying to make with reference to the US protesters in particular, that by allowing any of them, and I'm not saying that the protesters have not been goaded into this by police on the ground as well. There's been some fairly well documented examples of them behaving fairly badly. But are the protesters nonetheless taking the bait and giving Trump exactly what it is that he wants?
I think there are two aspects here. I think the needs for civil activity and to see civil society active and in some cases being in the street is very important, because without it, governments, because we live allegedly in democracies, but between elections, we have very little say in what's happening. So we have 4 or 5 years, depends which system. So it's good for citizens to be involved, especially when they feel the constitution is threatened, their freedoms are threatened, and civil disobedience and demonstration, I think, can be very helpful. I think where the fallback is when they use violence. So there is difference between peaceful protest, which can be very useful, especially if they are consistent, they're continuous, that people stay ready to stay in the streets for days no end and make their point. Where they fall into the Trump bait is when they use violence, because then it gives the excuse to send the National Guard, and especially when you have a state that's governed by Democrats, so it's great, Democrats versus the Republicans. Us, we believe in law and order because we are Republican, and Democrats believe in chaos. So that's what you get if you vote for Democrats. So rather not follow into this trap. But the idea that if there is no activism, then we don't fall into this or this bait. Then the government gets whatever it wants to do. And with the examples that it's about people ready, sometimes even to risk their life in order to make a point, because they feel that their freedoms, their rights are under threat.
I mean, is the key to successful protest then, Terry, and it may be impossible to impose past a certain point, but is it basically discipline? Because once you have, or at least once the government you're protesting against has, and I'm thinking again of the Trump example, just one image of somebody standing on top of a burning police car waving a Mexican flag, they've got what they wanted, haven't they?
Yes, I think it is. And I think, in the past, particularly when you look at civil rights protests in the United States, people said, you have to organise, and you have to organise in quite a careful way so that you know what people are doing and where they are protesting, what they are protesting against. And, there's quite a lot of work, I think, that often goes into that. And I think, one of the risks is when protests are spontaneous, it's much, much harder for any organiser, if there is no organiser, to kind of say, look, simmer down, we are only doing this, we are only going as far as that. But sometimes, I'm not saying, even big, well-behaved protests sometimes don't really change anything. People often think that the size of a rally or the size of a protest is like a reliable indicator of the strength of feeling. And I'm thinking of, sort of anti-Brexit marches in the UK. They were huge and they were very well, jolly and polite. And I'm not sure they really changed anything at all.
Indeed not. If we look, Yossi, at, I guess, the more focused stunt variety protest, as we are seeing with this yacht that was sailed towards Gaza. Now, they were taking what was clearly intended to be a token amount of humanitarian aid, because a token amount of humanitarian aid is all that is going to fit on a boat that size. Fine. Clearly, the point they were making was the point of the exercise. But do you run the risk, do you have to play it through to worry about, do we end up looking somewhat ridiculous? Because what has happened here is that the Israelis have intercepted the yacht. They've rather witheringly said, sure, we'll take the aid and distribute it. Thanks for that parcel of sandwiches you've brought along. And now we're putting you all on planes and sending you back home.
It's a PR stunt, which is
what protest essentially is.
Yeah, some more, some less. Some really think they're going to make a change. In Gaza, that you need 600-700 lorries a day of aid. Obviously, such a small boat won't make a huge difference. But the fact that it's reported everywhere, the fact that they send an elite unit to stop a group of activists, and the big threat against them that they will show them a horror film of what Hamas did. Because I don't think it's legal even to force someone to watch a video I never heard about this kind of punishment, only to kind of educate them what happened in October 7. I think the government is overreacting to this. It's a small boat. Yes, there is activists there. Whether that's what they should do instead of, for instance, concentrate on the environment where she actually made a difference, probably will make less difference.
This is Greta Thunberg, you mean, who is one of the crew of the boat.
But I really think that there is a place for this kind of activism, even if it's not going to make a huge change. And there is a kind of contribution, but any time that a group of people highlights something that goes really wrong in our society, it contributes for us discussing it here. And I already give a few interviews about that today. So there is a discussion about that. So people talk more about the need for humanitarian aid and how bad is the situation there. And I think sometimes, of course, the way that in the case of the Israeli government, that they overreact, create even worse publicity about the situation there.
Is there then, Terry, and I'm just thinking out loud here, a value in, a different kind of value in the different kinds of overreaction that you might provoke from a government? Because there is. You can see how a PR manager might have said to the Israeli government, look, just ignore them. Just say to them, sure, you want to sail your yacht to Gaza, go ahead, have a good time, see if we care. And it would probably drop off the news radar somewhat more quickly. But is there a value in provoking the reaction that makes the government you're protesting against look actually absurd rather than sinister?
I think, if you... It's a tricky line to tread because, I think, governments that are being protested against don't usually have much of a sense of humour about it. And so, unless you've got somebody that can respond in quite a sort of, human and normal way, and those tend to be the kind of people that don't get protests against them very much, it's quite hard, to judge that line. How do you know that whether, you might risk yourself, you think that your protest is going to be fine, you end up getting shot at and getting seriously injured or something like that. So, there is a risk that people run. And I think sometimes the best protests work with humour and with satire as well. I mean, maybe that doesn't affect that much of a change, but sometimes, lightening it does help a bit.
I mean, just as a final thought on this, Yossi, and again, at the very real risk of sounding like a table full of prissy liberals pronouncing solemnly on the virtues of peaceful protest, if you are a beleaguered head of government of some sort, if we look at these three varieties of protest, and this is not to describe, to be clear, the Los Angeles protests as necessarily violent, because reports suggest that overwhelmingly they actually haven't been, but it is just a fact of life that whenever there is trouble, that's what tends to lead the broadcasts. But if you are the potentate facing either violent street protest, non-violent street protest, or this sort of pinprick publicity stunt akin to a yacht sailing towards Gaza, which one are you most frightened of?
I think actually the peaceful one, because
That's what I'd have thought.
The peaceful one you don't know how to deal with. If you have hundreds of thousands of people, think about Serbia towards the end of Milosevic. And there is actually almost a manual written by the American academic in Boston, Gene Sharp, how to do it properly. And don't provoke the police, because the police just waiting for being provoked, and then they will hit you harder, and they'll start the arrest, and then it will create the kind of potentially even bloodshed that never works for the protesters. But when you have all these people staying in the streets, ready to camp for time no end, and you get all the pictures, especially the age of mass media and social media, it's way more effective, because what the government is going to do. So in Spain, yes, there is corruption. In the case of Israel, there is a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, so they are not wrong that this is the case. And in the United States, the case of immigration, how the Trump administration deal with that. So they will force them, instead of inciting against the demonstrator, actually maybe to engage with their argument. And that governments, especially the populist ones, are not very good at.
Well, moving along somewhat, regular listeners to Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk, like there are any other kind, will know that the other week we did a whole thing about the safety of journalists in the current general context, he said with a grandiloquent sweep of forearm. A hazard we confess we did not consider is the sensitivity of news agencies to push back to the personal opinions of their reporters. ABC News in the United States has suspended senior national correspondent Terry Moran over social media posts in which he made disobliging remarks about US President Donald Trump and his weirdo homunculus Stephen Miller. Terry, as a broad principle, where are we on this? Should news reporters report the news and beyond that shut their yaps, or are they entitled to say, here is what I think from time to time?
I think there should still be some kind of a divide between reporting and comment, and I think that divide has become increasingly blurred. You've got news presenters more and more doing sort of I'm going to do an introductory monologue where I tell you exactly what I think about it.
Who would listen to a programme like that?
No, but there is a difference. I mean, we're here to discuss and we're here to give our opinions, but if you're actually sort of reporting on what's happened, I think that can be more powerful, and then it's more powerful if you then say, this is what this government has done wrong with some sort of evidence and fact. I mean, I think Terry Moran got in trouble for sort of a late night deleted tweet, as far as I can see, and this wasn't something that he'd said on air. And I think there would be more if he'd worked out a sort of a way of saying the things that he wanted to say, and he could back that up. But I think, it shows how excessively sensitive the US government is, and how excessively sensitive news organisations have become, that they are then going to leap in and suspend somebody. But I think, there is still a place for some kind of impartiality as far as it goes.
Did he actually say anything especially outrageous here, though, Yossi? He described Donald Trump and Stephen Miller as world-class haters, and Donald Trump, of all people, you can imagine just fixating on the phrase world-class and thinking, well, that guy thinks I'm pretty cool. But suggesting that both of them, Miller in particular, are animated principally by hatred, which just does seem like a pretty bold statement of the facts.
Yeah, I didn't find someone that's used to read tweets.
Sorry, if Stephen Miller is listening, I wasn't doing a whole thing with bold there. But anyway.
Someone reads quite a few tweets in Hebrew. This is mild. This is really being gentle, because he used the word eat hate.
Yeah.
And actually, in a lot of the tweets in Israel, they call the eat death. Because those who support the war, which I think probably in this case of firing someone or suspending someone, this will go to a new level altogether. I just kind of, it kind of strikes me. There actually someone published about Stephen Miller a book, Hate Monger, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump and the White Nationalist Agenda, and this was written already in 2020. So not that it's not used.
Both men have been called worse things, is what we're getting at.
And just I looked at tweets by Stephen Miller today, and he says, we have been saying for years, this is the fight to save civilization. Anyone with eyes can see that now, and this is about Los Angeles. So basically he said about people in Los Angeles that are protesting, they are not part of civilization. Uncivilized, then you can translate barbarian and the rest. So he earned this kind of comment. Now, the thing, again, since in my other life I'm an opinion piece writer, but also sometimes I report things because I base some of the opinion also on certain information that I get. There is something between reporting and opinion. There's some overlap. So the fact that reporter, I think this oversensitive, and I think a lot of it to do. And since you remember, or we might remember, that Jeff Bezos was my villain of the year last year, is I think some of these publishers are so afraid of Donald Trump and say everything about the people around him, they forget that their first and foremost responsibility is towards democracy, towards freedom of speech, and towards their readers.
Well, indeed so. And on the thought of freedom of speech, Terry, there has been a predictable amount of pearl-clutching about this from Donald Trump's cohort. His press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, has called it unacceptable and unhinged. Vice President J.D. Vance has called it a vile smear. Not for the first time, I am compelled to wonder, why does it not register with MAGA types just what a bunch of thin-skinned whiners their heroes are? I mean, they are the absolute archetype of people who are happy to dish it out all day but cannot take it.
Yeah, and this seems to be the case. This seems repeatedly to be the case, that they will, launch lawsuits against news organisations, that they will try to ban journalists from briefings that they don't like. None of this is justifiable. But I think, still your reporting would be a lot more powerful if this wasn't a piece of reporting, so this was just something that he spewed out late at night, and in what frame of mind you don't know, and it was probably a silly thing to do. But do some reporting. But you've got to have the news organisations sort of saying, yes, go off and investigate Stephen Miller, what he says, what he's done, what he's actually doing in office, and that I think is the way to go.
Should we, do you think, Yossi, hold our breath waiting for members of the Trump administration to condemn just as quickly the things said about their political opponents on a more or less minute-by-minute basis on Fox News?
Probably not. It's they are very selective in what they criticize. Again, I agree. We know that in social media, I wish people will think 5 seconds before they put something on social media. And the language is really toxic and doesn't help. We used to think about social media as a great democratic experiment that we can share opinion and debate. And this is going to be... That was
always the problem, I thought.
And we almost thought this is going to be the real Athenian democracy, that everyone is going to participate. How naive were we when it crossed our mind. So we need to learn how to use that. But on the other hand, to use it in order to silence people. So it's enough that someone said, okay, as you say, the middle of the night, I tweeted something. I wish I never done it. Forget about it. Because honestly, if you suspend an American president for tweets that are inappropriate, there is going to be a vacancy there.
Well, 2 developments in the looming upturning of things by artificial intelligence. In South Korea, people have willingly sat through a musical entirely composed by AI, arguably one of the few behaviours less explicable than sitting through a musical composed by humans, especially when the piece is, as this was, a rock opera based on Hamlet. Elsewhere, Mark Reed, CEO of the advertising Leviathan WPP, has stepped down as the agency struggles to adapt to technology that allows plausible-looking advertising to be created by any Yahoo with a laptop, and on which front Meta, proprietor of Facebook and Instagram, is promising a full-dress AI ad service by the end of next year. I cannot wait. Terry, are there enough wild horses left in Asia that would drag you to attend a South Korean AI-generated musical based on William Shakespeare's Hamlet?
It would be an experience. possible. I think it just shows the difference, doesn't it? You know, Hamlet, a work of actual human genius created by one individual person 400 years ago that has lasted, and something which people described as, you know, overly melodramatic, weak and ambiguous. And it sounds absolutely dreadful. And I think one of the key things here was that the creators of this musical, or, well, you know, the humans that put it into, you know, actually onto the stage, said that, oh, the great thing about the AI is it doesn't argue with you. And I thought that's precisely why this is a bad thing, because there's nobody there to say, this doesn't work, this doesn't rhyme, you know, this is a terrible song.
Nobody wants a rock opera based on Hamlet by William Shakespeare.
No sort of human intelligence that sort of contradicting it. And I think that's one of the many problems with AI, is that it tells people what they want to hear. You know, it's kind of gets used to what you ask it and comes back with more and more stuff that, you know, you need somebody else to look at and say, no, this is a really bad idea, don't do it.
Yossi, I will declare that from where we currently sit, my interest in ever voluntarily consuming anything created by AI is more or less zero, but I will allow you to push back if you think that makes me sound like somebody who's circa, I don't know, 1981 said I don't want to listen to music played on a synthesizer.
I don't think so, because it's still made by human. It just reminds me that on Saturday I went to listen to the London Arab Orchestra, and it was beautiful choir of 80 people singing, and then 20-something musicians. It was not created by AI, and it was wonderful just to listen and to watch it, which something that AI, I don't think, at least for now, can create. And of course, there will always the debate that will say, oh, you probably in the beginning of the 20th century will still want to ride a horse and not to drive a car. Or you want to use a tractor or use the horses and the car. There's always this argument, but here we are entering to something completely different. It's because it's generative and predictive AI that eventually try to surpass what human beings can do. And I understand the temptation for many to do that because it's cheap and it's fast. So it probably took Shakespeare quite a bit of time to write any of the play. And some of the music that I listened on Saturday, people said and spend a lot of time. AI will do it very quickly. But is it the same experience? What about the human interaction in creating it, and the impression that it makes while you are doing that and while you are sharing it with other human beings? And this is missing here.
Well, you say cheap and fast, which reminds me, Terry, of at least one advertising creative of whom I have heard, who at one stage of their career worked beneath a sign which read cheap, fast, good, pick any two. But do you have any concerns or hopes, I guess, that where AI is concerned, that it may, for the creative industries, as its cheerleaders are suggesting, be more of an enabler than a wrecker?
I think it is probably going to it may well get rid of a lot of routine jobs. It will probably destroy a lot of work. I think it's already happening in terms of not so much creative stuff, but certainly things like copywriting and those kind of jobs are probably going to be diminished by AI in the very near future. I think it's a bit like the creation of processed food. Lots of people thought, well, great, you know, this is cheap and, you know, probably not good, cheap and fast, you know, those two of the three. But I think maybe we will come through it in a way to people will actually say, well, no, I want the real stuff. I want, you know, the proper made bread rather than the industrially produced slop. But the question is how we are going to actually be able to tell the difference.
Every revolution has its counter-revolution.
Yeah.
So but might if proceeding with Terry's analogy with food there, it did turn out, Yossi, that quite a lot of people, in fact possibly even a majority of people, are quite content with cheap, easy, mass-produced slop. Is there going to be, in this instance, enough people who don't want that to keep the rest of us in business? Or 6 months from now, is this going to be AI-generated simulacra of our own voices talking according to ChatGPT prompts? Indeed, would anybody know now if it isn't?
And we'll sit at home and listen to ourselves, something generated by AI. But you see, it's still not the same quality. We have to be convinced. And I think about the teaching profession. And when students sometimes decide to submit.
Sometimes.
Yeah, I give them the benefit of the doubt that it's not everyone. And it's easy to spot. and it's not the same quality. And you see that they don't read it. And at the end of the day, at one point, they realize in their professional development that they missed on the opportunity to enjoy the development, the professional development, as writing their own essay instead of sitting in, in nanoseconds to get an essay, which is all right, and you can pass, but you get absolutely zero out of it.
Terry, just finally, speaking as the person at this table who most recently created a work of creativeness of some sort, did you at any point decide to engage with AI at all?
Only when it came to writing my autobiography, because I sat there and I couldn't think. You had to talk about myself, and I didn't really want to do it. And I put it into ChatGPT, and it came up with a biography of someone who was really plausibly like me, but not me. Similar education. It said I'd worked at The Guardian instead of the BBC. It said that I'd written a novel called The Bone Church, which I hadn't, but I quite like the title.
Maybe
it sounds quite good.
Yeah.
Maybe I should. Maybe the computer wants me to. So that was really
strange.
Maybe
you could just get
because
the computer to write it.
It did hallucinate sort of various things about me. It was a plausible fictional character, kind of loosely based on me. But I have seen that there are some, I think, self-published novels recently which have been uncovered where people have left the prompts in, where people have literally written bits in that said, make this bit more exciting. And they haven't edited out the bit that says, make this bit more exciting. So, I promise I didn't do that for the
So it's more a future telling than actually telling who you are.
Yeah, but then surely you just have to type in a prompt, please take out all the obvious prompts that make this...
You would hope, but they hadn't read it back enough to do that, which is... Yeah.
Honestly, and no disrespect, it's probably ultimately quicker to just write the damn book yourself. Terry Stiasny and Yossi Meckelberg, thank you for joining us. And finally, on today's show, when people who worry about what Russia might do next worry about what Russia might do next, their thoughts generally turn to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, 3 tiny countries which recovered their independence from Moscow in the early 1990s. A new book by Oliver Moody, Berlin correspondent for The Times, considers not just the Baltic states, but the wider Baltic region, an almost inevitable theatre of any future further conflict between Russia and the West. The book is called Baltic, The Future of Europe. I spoke to Oliver earlier and began by asking whether Western policymakers before 2022 did not understand how threatened the region was, or were pretending they didn't.
I don't think they had a concept of it as a region. I think they looked at the 3 Baltic states in isolation as a point of military vulnerability. And that was certainly very well understood at the very latest in the aftermath of the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea, when you started to see all of these very melodramatic scenarios coming up about a sort of Moscow-inspired insurgency somewhere in northeastern Estonia or southeastern Latvia, followed by the Kremlin sending tanks in across the border to secure their so-called compatriots. So this is definitely a strategic problem that has been exercising minds in NATO and in particular in European NATO for about a decade. But it is also certainly true that the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has sharpened this issue. And what I argue in the book is that with Sweden and Finland joining NATO and with the greater awareness of the strategic importance of Poland, the broader region of northeastern Europe has become the theatre we should be talking about in this context rather than the Baltic states on their own.
Yeah, we should make clear that Baltic, in the context of the title of your book, doesn't just refer to the Baltic states. It's the entire Baltic region, all the countries which have shorelines on the Baltic Sea and all of which you visit. And I'll get on shortly to what you learnt from visiting them, but did you get a consensus from the people who govern those countries about what they think Russia actually wants in the Baltic states or in the Baltic region? Because Russia is, of course, what everybody is concerned about.
There is absolutely no consensus out there about what Russia wants and what lengths it would take to get what it wants. The best guide that we have, and this is the kind of minimum consensus, is that Putin gave us a pretty good indication of what he does want in the months leading up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So we're back at the end of 2021, where his negotiators were in Washington and astonished their American counterparts by suggesting that NATO withdraw its forces to behind what had previously been the eastern boundary of the alliance before 1997 and the so-called Big Bang expansion. And I think that is a pretty good place to start, this idea that by hook or by crook, and in whatever form it may take, Putin's ideal outcome geopolitically would be to see NATO in some way divided and thrown back in a way that would allow him to assert some kind of sphere of influence over northeastern Europe.
And just finally, amid all this tension and concern, did you detect any optimism about what the future could hold for the region? I mean, the scenario I have myself run past various Baltic politicians is, and by which I mean Baltic states politicians, is it imaginable at all that one day the Baltic states might live alongside Russia as contentedly and calmly as the three Benelux countries now do alongside Germany?
From all the conversations that I've had over the last 4 years with government officials in the Baltic states, I've never encountered one who believed that that was possible unless and until Russia suffers some kind of defeat that is drastic enough to fundamentally reorientate its domestic politics away from imperialism and away from revanchism. Any future security architecture on the eastern flank of NATO, from their perspective, is inevitably going to be based on what Kaja Kallas, the former Estonian Prime Minister, now the European Union's High Representative, has called smart containment, which is basically predicated on indefinite sanctions in economic terms and very high levels of defense spending and military readiness, not just on the eastern flank, but across European NATO as a whole. If there is optimism, it is partly the hope that the second Trump presidency, and in particular J.D. Vance's notorious speech at the Munich Security Conference, have shocked the rest of Europe out of whatever complacency was lingering in particularly Western and Southern European politics. And then there's also a deep kind of belief that a future could be better in economic and technological terms. If you look in particular at the way that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia talk about artificial intelligence and compare that to the European Union's regulations, there's much more belief in the transformative power of modern technology for the better.
That was Oliver Moody, author of Baltic, The Future of Europe. It's available now and very much recommended. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Terry Stiastny and Yossi Meckelberg. The show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Francesca Jokes. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.